Friends, and thank you for listening. I'm Scott Sullivan, Discipleship Catalyst with the Georgia Baptist Mission Board, and our team exists to strengthen Georgia Baptist churches in the area of discipleship. We've developed 3 tools just for you. The Watershed Principle, which identifies the 6 main ministries of the church that must be healthy to produce world-impacting disciple makers. The Spark Conference. Last year's conference saw over 33,000 views from 45 different states and 18 countries. This year's conference will premiere on August the 12th with best-selling author Tony Evans, Ben Mandrell, president of Lifeway, and David Kinnaman, the president of the Barna Group. We also have learning communities that are set up throughout Georgia, which exist to help you finish the task of leading your family in ministry well. You can see our website to find one near you. Also, every Thursday at 3 p.m., you can catch this broadcast through Facebook, Instagram, or multiple podcast platforms. Now, let's join today's broadcast. Welcome, Disciple Makers. Thank you for engaging with us, and we want to hear from you, so please do a couple of things for us. Drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from and get entered into the drawing for free product at the end of the broadcast. Now, we also want you to share this link if you find it helpful so that we can maximize gospel reach and impact as we bring to you quality discussions each week. Now, today, we're going to be discussing one of the hottest topics that's been circulating around church leaders really for probably the past decade or longer. Earls is the senior editor for Lifeway, and he wrote a blog that was top 10 characteristics of churches that keep young adults. Obviously, we have struggled with this for more than decades of being able to keep our young adults when they leave and they go to college and get into young adulthood. And there's a lot been written about why things are that way and all the problems with it. Aaron, I want to bring you on here now. And the thing that I appreciate about what you've done is that you have created a blog that is focused on it's kind of like Steve Parr's book when he wrote that book, this is Why They Stay. You have focused on the positive data of what we've done right. So Aaron, welcome, my friend. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Scott.
You betcha. So do this for a second. Just take it 60 seconds. Tell us about what you do at Lifeway Research and maybe a little bit about the data, the study behind the blog, top 10 characteristics of churches that keep young adults.
Sure. So I'm the senior writer and editor at lifewayresearch.com. And so what I see my role there is taking the excellent statistics and data that our research team develops and goes out and talks to churchgoers, pastors about, and then taking that and kind of translating it into some practical information, some things that church leaders and pastors can take away. If you're a pastor or church leader, you've got a million different things you're trying to do. It can be really difficult to learn the ins and outs of research and all those things. And so hopefully what I can do is I can go and talk to our researchers that know all that stuff, that have decades of experience and education in those areas. And all right, explain this to me. Explain it to me like I'm 5. Help me understand what these numbers mean. And so I can do that. And hopefully what I can do is take what, kind of their explanation for it and then kind of translate that and say, okay, here, church leader, pastor, this is what this research is. This is what it means. This is what it says. And here's some practical takeaways that you can take this research and apply this to, your church, your ministry there in your area. And so that's kind of what led to this article about 10 characteristics of churches that keep young adults. Is Lifeway Research did this huge study of young adults that stayed. They started off, we're going to find, young adults that attended church for at least 1 year as a teenager. And ask them, all right, are you attending church now? Did you drop out? Are you still there? And so looking at that and kind of interpreting that data, with that, you've got 2 in 3 that attend church as a teenager, drop out as a young adult. And so at some point they're dropping out of church. 1 in 3 stayed. And so what I wanted to do was, look at this research and say, all right, are there some things that kind of unite and kind of tie together those churches that kept young adults? The churches, the 1 in 3, like what characteristics kind of do they share about their churches? And so I wanted to look at that and kind of see what can I give the church leaders to say, these are the things that kept young adults there. And not just for church leaders. Honestly, this is a personal matter for me. I have 2 teenage sons, and I want my church to be a church that, that they feel involved in, they're invested in places that they feel that they value and they feel valued. And so, I wanted to take that, provide that for myself and for our church, and also provide it for other church leaders so they can take it and say, all right, what can we apply for our church, for our congregation that can help us kind of retain the young adults that we have here in our church?
Absolutely. And I'm right there with you. I've got 2 older kids and 2 younger. So this topic is huge for me, not just from a disciple maker standpoint with Georgia Baptist churches and 3,400 churches, but just as a dad and a local church leader as well. So now listen, you mentioned 10 words in the blog for local church leaders to consider if they want to really create the atmosphere where young people remain engaged in the local church life. So here's my question. 2 of those words, to me, as I read it, they're different and you had different perspectives, but they're similar and they're moving in the same direction. And they were sincere and authentic. So unpack for us why these concepts are so critical for the local church to understand and to portray that if they want to keep a connection with that younger generation.
Sure. I think one of the things that's encouraging to me, I grew up in a small, dead end road, tiny church, in South Carolina. That's where I grew up. And, we didn't have all the gigantic programming. Our student ministry wasn't huge. And so I think churches can get discouraged if they don't have all the latest, greatest, gadgets and programs, and their church ministry, their student ministry is at 3,000 people and all those things. So many of these characteristics, including this, sincerity and authenticity, there's stuff you can cultivate in a church of 50 people. It's not things, those huge student groups in ministry didn't have a statistical impact on retaining young adults. It's these characteristics. And you mentioned sincerity and authenticity, and they were, 2 of the big ones. And they can be kind of buzzwords that people slap on top of things. Oh, we're sincere. Oh, we're authentic. Oh, we're authentic. But these have to be characteristics that the teenagers actually see in the congregation. They're not marketing slogans. They're not, things that your church says about themselves. There's things that teenagers see. And so if they see a church that's insincere, inauthentic, they're more likely to drop out. A lot of the times adults can assume that teenagers want leaders to tell them what they want to hear. The teenagers, they feel like, if we just kind of, feed them, the stuff they want, that'll keep them around. The research seems to say the opposite. So, what I would encourage pastors and student ministry leaders to do is to just work to cultivate genuineness and honesty with their teenagers. Have hard conversations, but honest conversations. Don't work to be something that you're not. Build yourself and be your church as something that that you don't really have. Work to live up to the values you proclaim. And I think that resonates with teenagers. They're looking for. They see the shiny, overproduced stuff out there, and they've seen enough of that. I think this research says they really resonate with churches that are seeking to be sincere and that they can care about them, on a personal level. They're not looking at them as a number. They're not looking at them as somebody to bulk up, whatever statistics they may have for their congregation. They're looking at they want to see churches that care about them as individuals and that really value them in that way.
Yeah, for sure. I love Dahadi Lewis's comment when I was interviewing him. He said, authenticity is the apologetic of our day. Mm-hmm. And it's like the idea that authentic church requires authentic believers whose life matches their teaching. And Aaron, I feel like we've lost, a portion, a majority of the last 2 generations of younger people who are looking to the church to lead by example, not just to talk it, but to live that out and show that, this Christian life really is worth the effort. And there really is power when you are involved in the Word of God and a person of prayer, and the Holy Spirit is driving who you are and what you do. Great thought there. Now, here's another question. Another word or concept or phrase that you use in this article says avoiding hypocrisy. Now, this is, can be so damaging, obviously. We've talked about this for years, really for lifetimes. And I hear so much, Aaron, when people make comments like, man, the church is full of hypocrites, and every time I hear that, I'm like, I agree with that. And like, I'm the chief of those because I am, none of us live up to really the model of Jesus' example. So we are going to be hypocritical. Here's my question: when you think about the tension that's involved there, help our listeners understand how a church can guard against the hypocrisy that's so prevalent in the church experience.
Yeah, and so just kind of look at the statistics of it. 1 in 5 who stayed in church described their church that they grew up as hypocritical. For those that dropped out, it jumped to 1 in 3. And so this is a significant issue for teenagers as far as what kind of pushes them to stay or leave. And, I think we can get caught up in looking at hypocrisy as like, well, that just means I've got to be perfect. Well, that's not really what they're looking for. One of the things I wrote in the piece was that the next generation isn't looking for perfection from a church, but they do want honesty and integrity. And I think so often we've been conditioned to, we've got to hide our faults, and we can't let anybody know that we're hurting. We can't let anybody know that we're struggling. We can't let anybody know that we're doubting anything. And, teenagers recognize that everybody struggles. Everybody has doubts. Yeah. But when they see, leaders and pastors pretend as if that's not the case, or pretend as if everybody else is the one that's struggling and doubting, then they know something's up, and they see past that. And so, I think it matters that those in leadership at church live up to those values. I mean, we see so many times where, unfortunately, just recently, we've seen so many church leaders, fall and have their, kind of platforms be stripped away from them for their own personal sin. And so one of the things that God's really been hammering on me and in my heart lately is to make sure that my character is more sturdy than my platform. If pastors and church leaders have been given a platform to speak God's truth in the life of the congregation, including young adults, we have to make sure that we're on the back end, putting that time in behind the scenes for our own relationship with God and our own personal integrity, so that we're building that up. We're not concerned necessarily with our reputation. We're concerned about our character, making sure that follows. And so I think, teenagers can see that. They can see when people are being, authentic, and they can see when people are not being that and being hypocritical in the way that they, apply, certain biblical standards or judgments and those things.
Yeah, that's good. To your point, I think that many of us as leaders and disciple makers, we may need to be less incredible and more credible in our approach and the way that we live. Here's another. Your blog mentions that 38% of those studies said that the church was judgmental. And we've heard that, and we've battled against that. My question to you on this point is, how can a church avoid that crippling experience of coming across as judgmental? But here's the tension. We don't want to come across as judgmental, but for the believer, there is a biblical concept of holding people accountable. You see the tension that I'm dealing with there? What would you say to that local church leader?
Absolutely. So if you look at the research, so 38% of those that dropped out said that their church was judgmental versus 26% that stayed there. And so, we're dealing a lot of this with the perceptions of teenagers, young adults. So that can be a little bit tricky. They may not have the whole picture of everything that's happening, but that shouldn't then stop us as church leaders from examining ourselves and our hearts and our congregation to make sure, okay, is there some truth to what they're saying? And so, I kind of go back to Paul. Like, are we speaking the truth in love, as he said in Ephesians? Going back to the hypocrisy thing, are we removing the log from our own eye before we seek to take the speck of someone else's? I mean, so the easy answer would be, to live out the Sermon on the Mount. That'd be the easy answer to kind of all this. But I think it goes back to, we talked about authenticity. The next generation is not looking for a church that hides what they believe, but they do want us to be consistent in how we apply our standards and our principles. I think if a teenager sees a church that's consistent, they're consistent in what they say, consistent in what they do, consistent in how they apply those things, I think we do them a disservice if we don't think they can recognize the difference between biblical church discipline and worldly judgmentalism. I think they're smart enough to see the difference there. If they see a church that's being consistent in what they say and what they do and how they apply those biblical standards, I think they're smart enough to recognize the difference between being judgmental and really trying to apply church discipline and church, standards.
Yes, and amen. I love that concept. I love that word. And, I think for many of us that lead in the local church or have that responsibility, I think it's good to remember that people who are not believers are going to act like unbelievers. So our role in the church is not holding them accountable, but for in the church, we do, to what you mentioned there, is we do in a loving way hold our people accountable. And man, that was so good because you mentioned the concept of when we're consistent, that's when we hold credibility and people can believe in the church. And my goodness, has there ever been a day that our community and our church members need to believe in who the church, the Big C Church, is. Hey, one more comment question here for you. So I've said for years that the most attractive element of a healthy, growing church might be unity. When you think about the community looking at us as the church, that it may be that the most attractive element for us is to be unified. So help the local church leader, those who are listening, viewing, with some practical examples of the importance of unity as we attempt to reach this younger generation.
Sure. I think if you look at it, I think there's two levels of that. Look at it on the micro level. If you're a teenager, like you're in high school and you're dealing with all the different cliques and groups and things that you're not part of that group, you're part of this group, you're not, and there's so many cliques they have to navigate. It can be exhausting. I remember, just being in high school as long ago as that was for me. There's a lot of work that's involved in that, of trying to appeal and appear like you fit in the right group. That's exhausting. And so, the last thing a teenager wants to do is deal with that all week at school and then have to come and deal with that at church on Sunday and with student ministry. And so, just working through that on a personal level. But honestly, if you look even broader than that, if you look at our country and how much division is out there across so many levels, how much, if a teenager can look and they see the division in their schools, the division at the, in the nation, they see division everywhere. So many parents are breaking up and divorce is rampant. And so all these different things that are happening, this teenagers are seeing this division everywhere, but they come to church and it's real and it's honest and they're unified. Like how attractive is that going to be, to every generation, but especially the next generation? How much is that going to draw them in and make them want to be part of something that they see? Like, these people, they love each other, they believe, what they say, they're living it out, they're unified in that. That's something I want to be a part of. I want to be part of that as an adult, and teenagers the same way. They want to be a part of that. But I think even beyond that, just as a general thing. So there's a most recent American Congregation study. And one of the things they found was the serious lack of conflict. So if a church hasn't had conflict in the last 5 years, that's one of the top 7 predictors of church growth. So if your church is fighting and divided, you're not growing.
It's interesting.
So that's going to be, both for, adults and for teenagers. But I think you're right. I think unity is even more so than ever. Obviously, it's always been a thing. Jesus prayed that his followers would be one and be united. So that's obviously a huge, concern for Jesus' heart. So I think there's been a case since the history of the church has been that way. But I think even more so today, how much more that unity is needed and can help, retain our young adults and reach out to our community as well.
That's so great. Listen, Aaron Earl, Lifeway Senior Research Editor and Writer, we appreciate you being here with us, buddy. This topic is so timely. It is so important. You've given some great ideas, great research behind some of the problems that we're dealing with. And so just thank you for jumping on with us. Now, friends, listen, if you've got other questions that you're interested or things you're struggling with, please put that in the comment. We want to continue to interact with you through the comments over the next few days. So big thank you to Aaron Earls and also for Mike Taylor, who's our producer today. And my prayer for you, friends, as you go throughout the rest of your day, your evening, and through the weekend, is that you will reinvest the gospel seed that was shared with you so that we can make world impacting disciple makers.
Thank you for listening. And we want to give you a gift, the 5 discipleship shifts most churches need to make to produce world impacting disciple makers. You can get this by going to ministryboom.com. That's ministryboom.com. This 5-page PDF is a discipleship alignment checklist that may surprise you. It will help you learn why programs are killing your discipleship, the number 1 default worker strategy that keeps churches from empowering their ministries. Learn the OGV factor and how it can revolutionize discipleship, attendance, and evangelism in your church. Again, go to ministryboom.com. The Georgia Baptist Mission Board is able to provide resources like this because of gifts from Georgia Baptist to the Cooperative Program. For more information on this broadcast and a customized discipleship plan for your church, visit gabaptist.org/discipleship. And by the way, if you found this content helpful, we sure hope you'll share it with a friend. And thanks so much for partnering with us to make world-impacting disciple makers.